This was the kind of family every man dreamed of having. Amarjit Chohan had it all: a loving wife, adorable kids, and a thriving business worth £5 million. But just 2 days after that joyful family video was taken, they disappeared without a single clue. And it leaves you wondering, why would a happy family vanish? Could it be anything other than murder? What unfolded next sent chills through even the most hardened detectives. Police would later call this case one of the most horrifying and unique crimes they'd ever encountered. So unbelievable. It seemed like something out of a twisted thriller. The mastermind behind it came dangerously close to outsmarting the law, and by the end of this story, you'll be left stunned at how this chilling mystery was finally unraveled. To really get a sense of this story, let's take a trip back to the early 2000s, specifically 2003, and head to Heathrow, a bustling area in the United Kingdom. It was here that a thriving business called Seba Freight was making waves in the fruit import world. This wasn't just your average company, it was a booming empire. At the center of it all was a 46-year-old man named Amarjit Chohan. Most people called him Anil. Anil's journey was nothing short of inspiring. He was born in India but moved to the UK in his early 20s with big dreams of building a better life. And let me tell you, he absolutely crushed it. He worked hard, climbed the ladder of success, and eventually became the proud owner of Seba Freight, a business worth millions. But life wasn't just about business for Anil. He had a beautiful family that he adored. Anil was married to Nancy, a stunning woman who was 20 years younger than him. Together, they had 2 little boys, Davinder and Ravinder. Their home was full of love and laughter. Nancy's mother also lived with them, partly to keep Nancy company, and partly to help out since Nancy had just given birth to their second son, Ravinder. Now this family of 5 had everything you could ask for: love, success, and a bright future ahead of them. You could see how happy they were in the video footage shown in the intro. Smiles all around, kids playing, and a couple deeply in love. Life seemed picture perfect. But even with all this success, Nancy had one thing on her mind: home. She missed India deeply. The culture, the familiarity, the memories. It all pulled at her heart. She often brought it up with Anil, telling him how much she wanted to move back. She believed India's education system was better for their boys and felt they could build an even happier life there. So she wanted Anil to sell the business and start fresh in their homeland. Anil, on the other hand, wasn't one to rush big decisions like that, especially when it came to the business he had poured his heart and soul into. Now, if you ask anyone who worked for Anil, they'd tell you he was the kind of boss everyone wanted. He was known for being kind-hearted, generous, and laid back. In interviews with his team, they spoke warmly about how approachable he was. But like everyone, Anil had a past. Back in 1996, he had a run-in with the law and ended up spending 3 years in jail for tax evasion. It was a tough time, but instead of letting it define him, he used it as motivation to turn his life around. Once he was out, he poured all his energy into rebuilding his career and creating the successful empire that Seba Freight had become by the early 2000s. Fast forward to 2003, and this is where things take an interesting turn. A man named Kenneth Regan showed up, applying for a position at Anil's company. However, Kenneth wasn't your average job applicant. He was an ex-convict with a history of smuggling drugs. At first, Anil was hesitant about hiring him. But then, he thought about his own past. If he could thrive after a rough patch, why not give Kenneth the same chance? So, Anil decided to hire Kenneth, giving him a fresh start as a driver. At first, everything seemed fine. Kenneth blended in with the team, and the other employees noticed nothing out of the ordinary. It was business as usual at Seba Freight. However, around this time, Anil was seriously considering Nancy's wish to move back to India. He had been mulling over the idea of selling the business, and then, as if on cue, Kenneth came in with some interesting news. Kenneth claimed he knew someone who was willing to buy the company, and not just buy it, but pay £3 million in cash. Naturally, this offer piqued Anil's interest. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to fulfill his wife's dream of returning to their homeland while also making a hefty sum from the sale of his business. So on a seemingly ordinary day, February 13, 2003, Anil left his office, supposedly heading to Wiltshire to meet with this mysterious buyer. The deal sounded promising, but here's the strange part. He didn't tell anyone exactly where he was going or even share the name of the person he was planning to meet. It was as if he trusted Kenneth's word without question, eager to explore what seemed like the perfect solution to his family's plans. But then, Anil didn't return that evening. It was as though he had simply vanished into thin air. Nancy was starting to feel more and more anxious as the night went on. She had called the company, hoping to find some clue about Anil's whereabouts, but as expected, no one had seen him. Just as she was about to panic, her phone buzzed. It was a voice message from Anil. In the message, he told her not to worry, that he was fine, and that he couldn't make it home that night. He promised he would be back the following day, but something about it didn't sit right with Nancy. This wasn't how Anil normally communicated. She and her husband always spoke to each other in Punjabi. But the message she just received, it was in English. "Hello, Nancy, don't panic. I'm okay. I'll be back tomorrow." The words sounded like Anil, but they didn't sound like him. That's when she decided to call her brother Onkar, who lived miles away in New Zealand. Onkar was a journalist, and though he hadn't seen Nancy or their mother in nearly 9 years, they still spoke almost every day. She trusted him completely and needed someone to talk to. But that call with Onkar would turn out to be the last time he ever heard from his sister. 4 days after that, on February 17, 2003, Kenneth made a shocking announcement at work. He told everyone that Anil had sold the company to a woman named Belinda Bruin. To back up this claim, he produced a letter stating that Anil had sold Seba Freight and was retiring abroad with Nancy due to ill health. The letter even had Anil's signature on it. The news took everyone by surprise. No one had expected such a major change, and naturally, the employees were now worried about their jobs with the arrival of a new owner. However, the reality of working in a busy company meant that they didn't have much time to stop and dwell on the situation. There was no time to question the announcement or voice their concerns. Everyone just had to keep working and adjust to the sudden shift, unsure of what the future held. Meanwhile, in New Zealand, Onkar, Nancy's brother, was growing increasingly concerned. After a routine missing persons inquiry, it was discovered that the family home was empty. Neighbors and colleagues all seemed to believe that the Chohans had simply packed up and moved back to India, as Nancy had wanted. But Onkar wasn't convinced. He knew that Nancy or his mom wouldn't go anywhere without telling him. So if the police couldn't find any answers, he figured he would take matters into his own hands. He decided to fly to the UK and investigate his family's disappearance himself. Alone in a foreign place, Onkar arrived in Hounslow, the family's hometown, and headed straight for the Chohan house. What he discovered there would shock him to the core, and it set him on a path that no one could have predicted. With compelling evidence that his family had left the house against their will, Onkar didn't waste any time. He went straight to the police, determined to get them to take action. After presenting his findings, he managed to convince the authorities to launch a full investigation into the mysterious disappearance of the Chohan family. The case was handed over to DCI Andy Rowell, a seasoned investigator who wasted no time in getting to work. Rowell's first step? Interviewing the last person known to have seen Anil Chohan on the day he vanished, Kenneth Regan. Now, as mentioned earlier, Kenneth Regan was no ordinary man. In fact, he had a whole collection of names. He was also known as Ken Avery, but perhaps the most intriguing nickname he had was Captain Cash. The story behind that was simple but chilling. He was said to always carry around hefty sums of cash, often tucked into a case making him a figure known in the underworld for his money and shady dealings. Before he became a part of Seba Freight, Regan had quite a notorious past. Back in the late 90s, he was a career criminal, and not just any criminal. He was deep into the world of organized crime, running freight companies around the Heathrow area. But these companies were not just legitimate businesses. No, they were carefully crafted fronts for smuggling drugs into the country. Regan knew the ins and outs of the criminal world and had connections with some of the most powerful and dangerous criminal families in London. At the time, Kenneth Regan was living the high life, surrounded by criminals and making his money in all the wrong ways. He was enjoying the luxuries of his illegal activities: flashy clothes, expensive watches, and always rolling with a crowd of shady figures. But it was at a fashionable London bar where Regan's world collided with that of Belinda Bruin, the same woman who would later allegedly buy the company from Anil. Back then, she was a celebrity agent and socialite, living in the fast lane of the social scene. Belinda described Regan as a bit rough around the edges, not well educated but charming in his own way. She saw him as the classic rich wide boy type, the kind of guy who thought his money could buy him class. As time went on, Regan became fixated on Belinda. His obsession started when he began calling and emailing her relentlessly, saying things like, "I haven't felt like this in 30 years. You're like a drug." Rumors soon started circulating that they were in a relationship, though that was never officially confirmed. But on June 17, 1998, Regan's world came crashing down. He was caught with 25 kilograms of heroin, a massive stash. Facing a daunting 18 years in prison, Regan quickly made a deal to turn on his former associates and became a grass. His testimony led to the conviction of 12 major criminals, and in return, his sentence was reduced. 4 years later, when he was released from prison, Regan found himself with nothing. His assets had been seized through a confiscation order, leaving him in a small one-bedroom bungalow with his father. Despite his fall from grace, Regan wasn't ready to give up on his criminal ways. He was determined to make a comeback. And the perfect opportunity came in the form of Anil Chohan's thriving freight company. Regan saw it as the perfect front for his drug-dealing operations. Once again, he was planning to use a legitimate business to cover up his illegal activities. By this time, Belinda Bruin had given up her house in Chelsea for a fresh start in Devon. Regan's obsessive calls and letters had stopped during his 4 years in prison, but now that he was free, he began to pursue her once again. A few weeks after his release, Regan left Belinda a series of messages on her mobile, flirting with her. But in January of 2003, he left a message that piqued her curiosity, claiming he had a business deal he wanted to discuss. At the time, Belinda was dealing with personal struggles. She had a huge house, a large mortgage, 2 kids in private school, and her boyfriend had just left her. She decided to call him back. Regan told Belinda he was planning to take over Seba Freight and needed a new managing director. Although she had no experience in the field, Regan offered her a huge salary for just a 2-day work week. At first, he offered her £54,000, which she thought wasn't enough to cover her expenses. He quickly increased the offer to £72,000, which seemed more appealing. This job offer gave Regan a convenient excuse to visit Belinda at her isolated home in Devon. He'd come up with bizarre reasons for needing her help with forms or letters, and he would drive all the way from Salisbury or London just for a brief visit. Regan seemed increasingly fixated on the land around Belinda's farm, constantly complaining about the mud in the lane and suggesting ways to improve the property, like cutting down trees and building a wall with electric gates. Fast forward to February, 1 month after Regan had told Belinda about the job offer, and things were finally falling into place. Belinda was given a desk and a computer, and she began reviewing the company's books as Regan had instructed. However, on her second day, she felt unwell and decided to drive home to Devon instead of going to work. When she arrived, she was shocked to see a battered Jaguar and 2 men in her field with a digger. The men were William Hornsey and Peter Reese, both associates of Regan. Belinda was furious and demanded to know what they were doing. They explained they were building a drainage ditch. Belinda couldn't believe it. It wasn't just the ditch, it was the fact that they had done this without her permission. Regan arrived and tried to justify the digging by saying, "I thought you'd appreciate it." Belinda was livid. She made it clear that it was her land and they had no right to dig it up. Though she planned to have it removed, she was told to wait until summer. By 2003, Regan was on the brink of reclaiming his former millionaire lifestyle. He had taken control of Seba Freight, Anil Chohan's former company, which now served as an ideal front for his drug-dealing operations. For years, Regan had obsessively pursued Belinda Bruin from afar, and now she was on his payroll. It seemed as though Regan's dreams were finally coming true, but the dark secret behind his success was about to be exposed. When detectives sat down with Kenneth Regan to ask about the Chohan family, they were met with a story that seemed almost too perfect. Regan painted Anil Chohan as a desperate businessman, drowning in financial woes and unable to sell his business. His version of events suggested that, with no other options left, Chohan had simply vanished into thin air. It was a convenient narrative, but one the detectives weren't willing to buy. Using cutting-edge forensic technology, the investigators tracked both Regan and Chohan's mobile phone movements on the day of the disappearance. What they uncovered was nothing short of chilling. Chohan's phone, initially traced to the Hounslow area, suddenly pinged in the Stonehenge area just days after his disappearance. This wasn't far from Regan's home in Wilton, Salisbury, and the detectives quickly connected the dots. Regan's phone had met up with Chohan's in that very location. From there, the two phones traveled south, moving toward Exeter in the West Country, a path that seemed more than coincidental. But the detectives' pursuit didn't stop there. They found a lead that seemed almost too unlikely to ignore. Devon, the home of Belinda Bruin, the newly appointed managing director of Seba. The police planned to visit her, thinking she might know more than she was letting on. However, just when they were about to get answers, a tip arrived from a man named William Hornsey, an associate of Regan. Hornsey claimed to have important information about Chohan's whereabouts, stating that Chohan was very much alive and on the run. Hornsey's revelation that he was meeting Chohan in Newport to hand over stolen passports seemed like the break the detectives had been waiting for. They rushed to Newport, heading straight to the location Hornsey had described, the iconic bronze pig statue near the passport office. There they found Hornsey and Regan standing nervously, but something wasn't right. It was as if they were trying to spin the story into something else. Hornsey and Regan claimed that Chohan couldn't make it because, allegedly, he had somehow discovered that they were meeting with the police. The detectives, trying to piece things together, attempted to trace the phone Chohan supposedly used, but their efforts were in vain. The number led to an unregistered phone, and once again, they were left with nothing but frustration and the sinking feeling that they were being misled, pulled further into a web of lies. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every week, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Back at Seba, Regan resumed his work like nothing had happened, as if he wasn't at the center of an investigation. But the detectives weren't about to let this slip through the cracks. They called Belinda in for questioning, determined to get to the bottom of things. When Regan learned that Belinda was being questioned, his anger flared. He immediately warned her, telling her that if the police ever asked about his work on her property, she was to simply say he was helping with her water system. So on the day of the questioning, Belinda answered every question the detectives threw at her, but when it seemed like the interview was wrapping up, the detectives asked her if there was anything unusual about Regan's behavior. That's when Belinda hesitated before mentioning one peculiar detail. Regan had told her that if the police asked about him, she should say he was just helping with her water system. That one statement threw the detectives off. Without a moment's hesitation, they rushed to Devon, convinced that something grisly awaited them at Belinda's farm. They meticulously excavated the dig site where Regan had been working, conducting an exhaustive forensic search. Forensic archaeologists and pathologists worked tirelessly, but after 5 long days of digging, no bodies were uncovered. At this point, it seemed like they were hitting a dead end. No physical evidence tied Regan to any crime, and the case was on the verge of becoming a cold one. That is, until April of 2003, when a father and son duo decided to go on a leisurely evening paddle near Bournemouth Pier. As they glided through the water, something caught their eye: a bloated, lifeless body floating just beneath the surface. The body was unnervingly large and bloated, the feet floating above the water while the torso and face were submerged. The son immediately called emergency services, unable to shake the sight of the floating corpse. For nearly 3 long hours, the father stayed there, making sure the body would be found and the situation wouldn't go unnoticed. In an interview, he later recalled how that moment gave him absolute chills through his spine. The body was taken to a mortuary in Bournemouth, but it would be nearly a week before the authorities could confirm the unthinkable. It was indeed Anil Chohan, the missing businessman. But the truth was far more chilling than anyone had imagined. An autopsy revealed a horrifying sequence of events. Anil had suffered blunt force trauma to the back of his head, a brutal blow that had left him unconscious. But it didn't end there. Packing tape had been wrapped tightly around his mouth, clear evidence of suffocation after the head injury. The forensic experts concluded that the combination of the blow to his head and the suffocation was the likely cause of his tragic death. While the police were still processing this shocking discovery, the search for more evidence pressed on. This time, investigators were zeroing in on Belinda Bruin's farm in Devon, hoping to find something that would link all the pieces together. And they did. As they dug deeper, they uncovered burnt clothes, jewelry, and even some hairs buried in the soil, clues that pointed to a burial site on Belinda's land. After forensic testing, it was confirmed. The hairs belonged to Anil Chohan, and it became clear he had been murdered, buried at the farm, dug up later, and dumped into the sea near Bournemouth. The size of the excavation site raised even more questions. If they were just trying to hide one body, why dig such a large area? The detectives uncovered more clues, including jewelry that seemed to belong to Nancy, Anil's wife, and small poppers from baby clothes. It was a chilling realization. Anil's entire family might have been buried there too. With this new evidence, the investigation shifted gears. The case was upgraded to a Category A murder inquiry, the highest priority level. From then on, Kenneth Regan was the prime suspect, but both he and his associate, William Hornsey, had mysteriously disappeared. One day, as Belinda was driving home, she noticed something strange: a familiar car parked near her property. Her heart sank when she realized it belonged to Regan and Hornsey. There was no mistaking it. They were back, and it wasn't a casual visit. These were the same men she believed had dug a mysterious ditch on her land, a ditch she suspected was used to hide bodies. Her instincts screamed that something was off, but she stayed calm. Smiling nervously, she told them she needed to grab something from her shed and would return in a couple of minutes. The moment she was out of their sight, Belinda bolted to her car, heart racing, and sped off. She called the police immediately, describing the situation in detail. Officers were dispatched to her home, but by the time they arrived, Regan and Hornsey were gone. Not a single clue was left behind. That was the last time anyone ever saw the two men. But the story didn't end there. Days after the Chohan family had vanished, Belinda remembered something critical. There had been 3 men on her property that day. That meant someone else was still out there, and she was convinced it was Peter Reese. Now on his own, Reese was left to wrestle with the weight of his choices. As the days turned into weeks, guilt began to consume him. He bounced between hostels and boarding houses, always looking over his shoulder, knowing the police were closing in. One evening, while staying at a small boarding house, Reese struck up a conversation with the landlady. In a moment of weakness, he confessed everything. "Have you seen me on TV?" he asked her. When she said no, he unloaded the horrifying truth. He admitted that he was involved in covering up the disappearance and murder of an entire family. Reese insisted he hadn't killed anyone, but he admitted to helping hide the bodies. He even painted a chilling picture of Regan, calling him a psycho who had personally shot 2 babies. The landlady, shocked and terrified, knew she had to act. As soon as she had the chance, she alerted the authorities. Within 12 days, the police caught up to Reese. He was still on the run, moving from place to place like a shadow. But even after his earlier confession, Reese refused to cooperate. He wouldn't share any details about the murders or reveal where the victims were buried, leaving the authorities with more questions than answers. While the police were interrogating Reese, they received shocking news. A fisherman had discovered a decomposed body floating in the water. The body was so deteriorated that the police hesitated to show it to Unkar, fearing it would be too traumatizing. But Unkar insisted it was his baby sister, Nancy. He couldn't imagine not seeing her one last time, even though this was the first time he'd see her in 9 years. And it was after her death. 2 months after the disappearance, the police finally found Kenneth Regan hiding in Belgium. They brought him back to England to face justice. Surprisingly, 6 weeks after Regan's arrest, William Hornsey voluntarily turned himself in to the authorities. With Peter Reese already in custody, all 3 suspects were now under police watch. However, none of them cooperated. They stayed silent, refusing to answer questions or share details that could tie them to the crime. Even with all 3 men in custody, the police were still missing something crucial. Nancy's mother and her 2 babies hadn't been found. Without strong evidence, the police couldn't make a solid case for conviction. They needed more clues to ensure justice. That's when they decided to dig into the suspect's phone records, especially on the day Amarjeet met Regan at Stonehenge. What they found painted a grim picture. The record showed all 3 men traveling south to Salisbury, stopping at an apartment located at 3 Forge Close, the address of Kenneth Regan's home. The detective who led the investigation pieced together an alarming timeline. During the time Anil Chohan was missing, at least one of the 3 men was always at Regan's apartment. This led detectives to believe Anil was being held captive there, guarded round the clock to ensure he couldn't escape. It was during this time that the 2 men carried out their cruel plan, abducting the entire family from their home. The police believed that Anil was killed at Regan's apartment, while Nancy, her mother Charanjit, and the 2 babies met their tragic end in Hounslow. Despite this horrifying theory, the evidence the police had was purely circumstantial. They had no solid proof linking the suspects directly to the murders, and without it, their case remained shaky. When detectives searched Kenneth Regan's apartment, they found no signs of a struggle or violence. The place had been meticulously cleaned and redecorated. Regan had installed new carpets, replaced the couch covers, and made it seem as if nothing sinister had ever happened there. He had wiped away nearly all traces of what could have been crucial evidence. At this point, while the investigation strongly pointed to Regan and his associates, the jury needed more than just theories and suspicions to convict them. The entire nation was watching the case unfold, gripped by the horror of what had happened to this innocent family. People across the country demanded justice for Anil, Nancy, their 2 young children, and Nancy's mother. Yet, with each passing day, hope seemed to dim as investigators struggled to find that one solid piece of evidence. Just when it seemed like the case might fall apart, a breakthrough came, one that no one could have anticipated. This pivotal moment came from Anil Chohan himself, even in death. When his body was discovered, every item of clothing he was wearing was carefully preserved by forensic investigators. His shirt, pants, and shoes were thoroughly examined, but nothing was found at first. Months passed, and it seemed like the evidence they needed simply wasn't there. Then, 8 months after Anil's body was recovered, investigators took another look at his socks. And that's when they made a startling discovery. Tightly folded and hidden inside his sock was a single piece of paper. It was a letter, dated February 12, 2003, the exact day Anil had disappeared. The letter was addressed to Kenneth Regan at 3 Forge Close, Regan's home address. Investigators believe that while Anil was being held captive, he realized he wouldn't survive. In his final desperate moments, he thought of a way to leave behind a clue that would point to his killer. He folded the letter over and over again until it was small enough to hide in his sock, hoping it would remain undiscovered by his captors. The letter survived Anil's burial, the time his body spent in the water, and the months it took for investigators to find it. It was a testament to Anil's incredible courage and determination to seek justice for himself and his family, even when he knew he wouldn't live to see it. With the letter in hand, the case against Regan, Reese, and Hornsey was solid. No jury could deny their involvement in the horrific murders. The trial began in 2005, 2 years after the crimes. It was one of the longest and most chilling criminal trials in the history of England's Central Criminal Court. The proceedings revealed the depth of Regan's greed and cruelty, and the lengths he was willing to go to cover his tracks. Peter Reese, who had played a supporting role in the crimes, was sentenced to 23 years in prison. Kenneth Regan and William Hornsey, the masterminds of the plan, each received 5 consecutive life sentences, ensuring they would never walk free again. Peter Reese, who had played a supporting role in the crimes, was sentenced to 23 years in prison. Kenneth Regan and William Hornsey, the masterminds of the plan, each received 5 consecutive life sentences, ensuring they would never walk free again. As the investigation continued, more heartbreaking discoveries were made. The body of Nancy's mother, Charanjit Kaur, was found off the coast of the Isle of Wight. Like Anil and Nancy, she had been drowned. However, the bodies of the 2 youngest victims, 1-year-old Davender and 8-week-old Ravender, were never recovered. Though justice was served in the courtroom, the emotional scars left behind were immeasurable. Onkar, Nancy's brother, carried the weight of grief and unanswered questions. In an interview, Onkar couldn't hold back his tears as he wondered what his family had endured in their final moments and whether they had held on to hope for rescue. This case remains one of the most horrific crimes ever, with the sheer brutality of it all sending chills down the spine. What makes it even more disturbing is the innocence of the family involved, their lives cruelly taken in such a violent manner. The idea that 2 young children were caught in the middle of this violence is almost too much to comprehend. Now, we want to hear your thoughts. Do you think the sentencing was just right for those responsible, or could this have been a case where life for a life should have been considered? Was justice truly served, or does this tragedy deserve something more? Drop your thoughts below and let's discuss. If you like the way we create these videos and you want to help bring more cases like this to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you once again for watching.